It's to do with the overall thing we're going to sort of talk about, the time I spent in Scotland. I used to live in the Northwest Highlands around the time I wrote this piece. And it's to do with the experience of living there in that kind of spacious environment of mountains and lochs and the sea and the sky and that kind of thing. And also, as I'll talk about, the idea of, at the time, I'd been meditating for some years before then, on and off, and was very interested in the processes of the mind and so on. And also reading some books that related to the idea of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, popular science books, simple books. Way the quantum world relates to the real world was seen by some writers as a model for the way consciousness works, the way the objects, the thoughts in our minds arise out of the kind of fluidity of the background of the mind. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, and it doesn't really bother me whether that is, but it gave me ideas as to how to structure certain pieces I was writing at the time, including the Hanging Cloud Bridge, which is a very free-form sort of piece, in which objects, musical objects, motifs and melodies arise out of a more fluid background in the music. The music I've written over the years has always had very definite melodic ideas, motivic ideas that are fairly clear. But I've never wanted to structure those in a normal way that classical music has worked, particularly in the 18th to the 19th centuries, which is putting ideas into an ongoing harmonic framework of tonality, where there's a definite beginning and end to a piece, and you're taken on a sort of journey through the music. With the music I was writing at the time up in Ullapool, I was wanting to have these ideas just set into a much freer form and without any sense of reaching an end, without even a sense necessarily of a beginning, in which it's just a segment of time that passes, comes, it arrives out of the silence and it fades back into the silence again. It's a little bit like a gong being struck. So when you strike a gong, there's a lot of vibrations across the whole surface area of the metal, and the sound just hangs there in the air and disappears. So it's a bit like the piece is struck and it shimmers there for several minutes with different sorts of sounds going on, and then it just fades away at the end. I left Ullapool some years ago and I'm living in Penzance now, and I've been here for about 16 years. And I really like it here. Again, it's very spacious. I enjoy being near the sea, and it's a very conducive place to create. And in terms of Elizabeth has asked me in terms of the process of putting pieces together and getting ideas. When I start, I think like most composers, I start with sketches. So very small fragments, just loads of them, most of which end up in the bin. Eventually things start piecing together bit by bit. But it can take some weeks or even months before things join up. It's a little bit like having a jigsaw puzzle that you have to make the pieces and you don't even know what the final image is, but eventually things join up and things can relate suddenly in a very spontaneous way. I think that's the curious thing, that after days sometimes of getting nowhere, suddenly I write 5 or 10 bars of music that arrive fairly complete and don't need much revision. And so I think this is just, again, going back to the idea of how the mind works and how one can almost intuitively allow things to arise out of the mind. And that all these little sketches that get discarded are there really to create a context for the piece. That in my head they gradually build up a sort of harmony, a background series of images. And I think when I look at the music inside my head and almost visualise it, I see it as a spatial thing. Although music's a linear art, which obviously has this movement in time, I tend to see ideas dotted around inside my head as objects that I can then move around and cross-relate in different ways. When I write, I always feel it's best to let the intuitive mind make most of the decisions. And it's not that the logical and rational process is unimportant, and I think it's very useful to have one's logical mind kind of looking over one's shoulder, guiding things along and casting an eye on what's happening. But I think the momentary decisions one has to make can only happen on an intuitive level, and I think with music in particular, I mean, it's probably the same for the other arts, but with music there are so many parameters. There's not just melody, harmony and rhythm one has to think about, but there are things like contour, texture, dynamics, tempo. So many things going on that it would be impossible to logically plot these into some sort of formal organisation that one could rationally see as creating a piece of music. And I think the intuitive mind has so much more power here to be able to have almost like a gut feeling of how things should go together and what the order of things is. And particularly in a piece like the Hanging Cloud Bridge, it would be possible to actually chop it up and reorder it and get a different piece, but still a piece that would work. But I think ultimately the decision for where things kind of go works on the intuitive level rather than any sort of logical basis. If we create the world around us through our perception, then art, which as a word is of course related to artifice and artificial, art is also a self-contained medium that creates its own world and its own rules that can be articulated in various ways. The piece, The Hanging Cloud Bridge, is based on a print by the Japanese artist Katsushika Hokusai. The print is of the same name, and like all his work, it's incredibly detailed but incredibly clear in what's happening. If you look on the right here, you'll see there's a small Buddhist temple, and on this outcropping of rock here on the summit, there's a small tea room, and they're connected by this beautiful, very slender and delicate bridge. And the whole print is wreathed in this mist that rises up from the left corner here and has this slow energy that goes through to the right. And for me, it gives a feeling of weightlessness and suspension, a feeling of stasis, a slight timeless sensation that I tried to capture in the music. If I look at the start of the piece here, it begins with this very fluid figuration on the harp, which is there throughout a lot of the first page. And it's maybe as if this is like the mist in the print, this very swirling sort of figurations, but it's also potentially as if this is like the background thoughts in our minds that are constantly going on. And amongst this swirling figuration, from time to time, more concrete motifs arise. And then gradually we get definite musical objects that come into view or into our oral perception, like this small motif here, or the harmonics down there. And then we're back to swirling music again. And around this point, there's a melody which starts to unfold through the piece. And this carries on right through into this third page and releases another gush of music that runs through here. And then when we get to the end, we re-encounter some of the objects we heard earlier in the music, but this time in a very transformed manner. This motif here that comes near the end, we first heard there at the top of the second page. And similarly, these harmonics relate to this idea earlier on. So there's change and there's transformation, but it's not as if it has some sort of meaning in a context of reaching a finality or any great conclusion. It's rather like being in a garden and walking around and seeing objects from a different perspective, seeing a tree or a bush from a different angle. One just views these musical moments differently and hears them in a different setting. And then the music fades away at the end.